Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day Week in Review, where we will be discussing the last 7 founders of the day on Founder of the Day, both the YouTube channel and the website where I publish articles every day. Thank you for coming. Anyone who's watching in the past, this is where I stall a little bit for people who just found out I went live to come hang out, especially today because I'm about 7 minutes late, which I apologize for. It's just going to happen sometimes, but as people keep rolling in here, why don't we get started with our first founder? And of course, on Fridays, I don't do a founder, I do an anti-federalist. Though, before you get mad at me, if you're new here, I did all of the Federalists. We're going back through and looking at the anti-federalists. Right now, we're talking about Federal Farmer, and we are on Federal Farmer number 7. Federal Farmer number 7 is really interesting. When it was published in January of 1788, this was part of a second run of papers by the Federal Farmer. This run was trying to cash in on how financially successful the first run of Federal Farmers were. This paper in particular, the Farmer starts a discussion on the House of Representatives. He also goes into more of a generalization about the differences between free and what they called at the time arbitrary governments or despotic governments, or not even despotic, but authoritarian governments. That's why they call it arbitrary, is one person can arbitrarily make up any rules they want, although it doesn't necessarily have to be just one person. Either way, he makes it clear that what the American people should want is a free government. Now, he actually talks about there are 2 ways to steer the mechanics of government. You can use force, or you can use persuasion. Force is obvious. When you are, if the people are not listening to you, it might be because, I'm sorry, let me say this again. If the people are not listening to you, you might have to force them to listen to you. And that is usually not something you want to hear. I'm just going to correct this real quick. I apologize. This is bothering me. Nope, we're good. Really? Do one more. Okay, there we go. I think that's better. I don't like it when you see the top of the bookshelf behind me. I like it more consolidated. Oh well, sorry for interrupting. Anyway, it would have been distracting me for the next hour, so I had to get it out of the way at some point. Federal Farmer number 7. Okay, so we're talking about force versus persuasion. So when a government uses force, it's pretty obvious. You're not listening to the rules. The people don't care about your rules, so you have to use your army or policing power to force them to obey your laws. The other way to go about it is to persuade them by making good laws that they agree with and they will voluntarily comply with. Therefore, you won't have to force them. Now, this is hi Xavier, thank you for coming. Now, obviously, in any society, you're going to need some kind of police force. There are going to be people who don't listen to the rules that should be compelled to comply. But in general, what you're looking for when you create a government is a government that makes rules people like and just want to listen to. Now, the Federal Farmer in this anti-federalist paper makes it pretty clear. These are extremes. No one government is perfectly free or entirely arbitrary. Every government falls somewhere in the middle, though some have been very close on the arbitrary side, I will admit. The Farmer continues by letting us know, hey, maybe we should do our best in America to try and be as free as possible. We'll never get all the way there, but let's do our best to get there. He then notes that the best way to accomplish this is through representation. And from here, about halfway through Federal Farmer number 7, through the next 5 papers, I believe, he is focusing on the House of Representatives. And he very quickly goes to an old anti-federalist trope, which is that the House of Representatives is just too small a number of representatives to actually represent the 3 or 4 million people, as he puts it, throughout the young nation that they are trying at the time to establish. He thinks that this will unfortunately make it so that people who are attempting to, unfortunately because of this, the people running the House of Representatives will slowly become more associated with the wealthy elite in the Senate than they will be with the people themselves, and therefore the entire government will be out of reach of the people. Now, he goes a lot more in depth on this next week. We'll discuss Federal Farmer number 8, which is one of the most fascinating papers I've ever read. As always, that comes out tomorrow, a pre-recorded video I've made, but next Thursday we'll talk about it live too. What's really interesting about Federal Farmer number 7, though, is he goes through about 4 paragraphs comparing the different states. And it's really fascinating if you're trying to learn about the American Revolution, because he talks literally about, like, okay, so most state governors are elected for 1 year, except New York has 3 years and Virginia has 3, and he very specifically talks about the fine details of the differences between the state governments. He's using this as a way to argue, look, the people have more representation now when the states have power than they would under the Constitution. But he ends up giving us a nice little primary resource to see exactly how the states differed at the time. Now that that's out of the way, let's tell some stories. Excuse me. Let's talk about Robert Livingston. So, the Chancellor, as he became known early in his life. Robert Livingston is from the Livingston family. Now, he is involved with several of the most important transformative moments in American history, even though his name is fairly not well known at this point. The Livingston family, for anyone who researches the American Revolution, will probably recognize this name. And yes, he was one of the Livingstons. Now, Livingston Manor was one of, as I like to say, one of the feudal-style manors in New York that were inherited from the Dutch heritage 100 years before the American Revolution, and Livingston Manor was one of these manors. Robert Livingston was never Lord of the Manor, though several other Robert Livingstons had been Lord of the Manor. His father was also a Robert Livingston, who was not Lord of the Manor, and I tell you this because there's an R in his name. And what's really interesting about this R is what happened with a lot of these families is they would give a son a name, and they would give his middle name would be the same as their dad's. So I would be Jason Lawrence, if that's how my parents went about things. Problem is, Robert's dad is named Robert. So that R stands for Robert. Now, he usually just went by Robert R. Livingston to separate him from all the other Robert Livingstons, but his name is Robert Livingston. I'm going to let that sink in for a second. This guy's name is Robert Livingston, which is one of the greatest names I've ever heard. That being said, Robert Livingston was from a very important family. The Livingstons would be involved with the revolution all over the place. Robert was in New York City by just 27 years old. He'd already graduated from college and become the Recorder of New York, which is a nice stepping stone for a young man who's trying to get in politics and make his way up in the world of New York politics. He does this for a few years, and then he starts siding with the Patriots. And he makes such a stink about how right the Patriots are that Robert Livingston's kicked out of his job by the royal governor. So New York sends him to the First Continental Congress. I'm sorry, he did not go to the First Continental. They sent him to the Second Continental Congress. While he's at the Second Continental Congress, he's appointed to several committees. One of these committees is the Committee of Five, as it is historically known, and that is the committee charged with drafting the Declaration of Independence. Now, obviously, Thomas Jefferson did the heavy lifting with the Declaration of Independence. John Adams and Ben Franklin did some help, but Robert Livingston and Roger Sherman were also on that committee. And before anything is brought from committee to the Congress as a whole, well, the committee gets to take a look, which means Robert R. Livingston is one of only 2 men, technically 4 if you count Adams and Franklin, but 2 men who had nothing to do with the Declaration of Independence, but got to read it before anyone else in the world. Now, Robert ends up voting for independence. Well, to be fair, I'll remind you, New York abstained from voting on July 2nd, 1776, when they voted for independence. Everyone at the time was very attached to what their state's opinion was. They were representative of their states. So New York abstained, awaiting further instructions. It wasn't until about a week later, when those instructions arrived, having everyone else declared independence, that New York was like, oh yeah, by the way, we vote yes also. Robert Livingston was one of those people who voted yes to independence for New York, and then ran right home to New York, where there was work to get done, and did not sign the Declaration of Independence. Sorry, Robert, not on the Declaration of Independence, despite being one of those few people who got to read it before anyone else. He runs home and helps create the new New York. And once he does, he is appointed Chancellor of New York, a position he would hold for the next 20 years. Now, Chancellor, I'm not a legal scholar. It's very hard to explain. Most of us would recognize the term Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. New York had a Justice of the Supreme Court, and they had a Chancellor. The Chancellor and the Chief Justice were essentially just as powerful positions, but for different legal matters. The Supreme Court held, and again, I'm not entirely sure which, I'm not good at the legal lingo, but the Supreme Court would decide like personal cases, and the Chancellor would decide financial cases. No, reverse that. The Supreme Court would basically handle financial cases. Chancellor would handle personal cases, like family cases and things of that nature. So one of the arguments when the Constitution was written today were like, but there's only a Supreme Court in the United States government. One of the arguments was, why is there only a Supreme Court and no chancellorship? And the argument against that was, what are we, England? And so Robert becomes Chancellor, which is arguably, after governor, the most powerful position in the state of New York. And he holds this for 20 years alongside Governor George Clinton. He actually holds a position longer than George Clinton. Because he's Chancellor of New York in New York City, when George Washington shows up to take over as President of the new United States, he serves throughout the war. He doesn't actually serve in the war, but just to let you know, Livingston stays on the American side the whole time. Then they write the Constitution about 13 years later, and George Washington shows up in New York City to become President of the United States. And who are they going to have swear him in? Well, why don't we have the Chancellor of the city we're in? And Robert Livingston is the person who swore in George Washington and gave him the oath of office to be first President of the United States of America. Quite a high honor. Now, the Livingston Bible still exists. It's not the Washington Bible. It's called the Livingston Bible because it was his family Bible. Still exists. It's in the Masonic Lodge in New York City because he was a Freemason, as most of them were. Not most of them, but many of them. Then, in 1801, I believe it was, just after Thomas Jefferson becomes president, Robert Livingston finally leaves his position as Chancellor. Though everyone called him Chancellor for the rest of his life, he leaves his position as Chancellor because Thomas Jefferson has elected him to go to France to represent the United States to Napoleonic France. And while he's there, Napoleon needs to win some wars. He's thinking about invading England. He needs some money to do that, and he just lost a whole mass of soldiers to disease in the Caribbean. So, Napoleon offers to Robert Livingston, hey, Robert Livingston, would you like to buy some property? And Robert Livingston says, what do you have in mind? And Napoleon says, how about all of Louisiana? I'll have you reminded that all of Louisiana became the Louisiana Purchase, which is about 1/3 of the continental United States. Robert Livingston was the person it was offered to. Now, Jefferson does send James Monroe as an envoy about that time to help organize this mess, and Livingston and Monroe become the two people who actually make the Louisiana Purchase on behalf of the United States. Though I'll remind you, it also wasn't a purchase. That would be unconstitutional. It was a treaty. And part of the negotiation was, we'll give you money and you give us land. That was the way Jefferson got around the legality, the constitutionality of making the Louisiana Purchase. I'm going to take a quick sip of water. Now, and I'm looking down at my notes. I did forget to remind you, while he was Chancellor, if we go back to the 1780s, Robert Livingston had actually served as Secretary of Foreign Affairs from 1781 through the end of the war, before John Jay took over. So while John Jay was in Europe, was in Spain, Adams and Franklin, when they all signed the Treaty of Paris, their go-between was Robert Livingston back in the United States. The Continental Congress was not a federal government. There were not a lot of federal positions. There was a maritime court with 3 people on it. And then there was essentially Robert Morris, who was running finance in the Navy, Secretary of War, kind of, and then Robert Livingston running foreign affairs. Again, just to add to the weight of the gravity of the position he held. As I said, then he gave Washington the oath of office. Then he goes make the Louisiana Purchase, and then he comes back from France. And when he comes back from France, having made the Louisiana Purchase, he met some people, including a gentleman named Robert Fulton. Robert Fulton was someone who had just invented a pretty dang good steamboat. Now, steam had been around for a while at this point, but they were mostly using it to pump water out of mines. About this time, in the mid to late 1780s, actually, before even this, people were first building steamboats. And there was actually what I like to call the Steam Wars. And just as the Constitution was being ratified, a bunch of people were trying to get monopolies in different states to control steamboat authorities on different bodies of water. Now, that's why the patent system was invented in the not invented, but put into the United States Constitution. And that's why they made the first patent laws in the United States were for steamboats. But they never really went anywhere because people couldn't get good funding. They couldn't get a monopoly, which made it not very valuable. So they kind of fell off for a while there. Then Robert Livingston comes back with Robert Fulton and his steamboat that they named the Claremont. They named it after Robert Livingston's house, Claremont. The Claremont was more powerful than other ones, and they had something special. They were able to get a monopoly. New York State granted Robert Livingston and his pal Robert Fulton a monopoly for steam power in New York. So he took his steamboat, the Claremont, onto the Hudson River. Now, it used to take about a week, over a week, to get from New York City to Albany on a boat. Now it took 3.5 days. It cut the time in half. This is a gigantic maneuver for having a ship of this nature. I know it doesn't sound that flashy. It still takes 3.5 days. And I know it sounds like you're only going to Albany, New York. But at the time, Albany was the capital and one of the more important cities in the country because much of the fur trade ran through Albany. And again, I'll also remind you, this is about the time names like John Jacob Astor start trading fur out of New York. The Dewar family had already been trading through Albany to New York City. And it is this fur trade that has already made New York kind of important. And now, because you can get this boat up there, they start really talking about building a canal across New York State from the Hudson in Albany to the Great Lakes in Buffalo. And they do. And Robert Livingston is one of the main people pushing for this because he's got the monopoly on steam power, but also because this could be a vast boon of wealth. Now, not only is it fur from an animal that doesn't spoil you can trade, you could start moving food from the Midwest through the Great Lakes, down the Hudson River, down the Erie Canal, down the Hudson River to New York City. And they do. It is hard to underestimate how significant the Erie Canal was to making New York into New York, the New York City we know today. And a lot of thanks to that goes to Robert Livingston. Now, a bunch of people were involved in the Erie Canal. Gouverneur Morris was on the commission. DeWitt Clinton was the governor at the time. They called it DeWitt's Folly or Clinton's Ditch, which, he had the very last laugh on that after the marrying of the waters, as they called it. And Livingston, his house on the Claremont, Claremont, was the home port for the ship Claremont because it was right in between Albany and New York City. It worked out very well for him. Now, I think we've blown through all of Robert Livingston's life. Again, just to remind you, and I'm going to scroll back through and actually look at it so I don't forget anything. He helped write he was on the committee that wrote the Declaration of Independence, though he didn't do much work on it. He built, in large part, the New York State judicial system. He was Secretary of Foreign Affairs during the ratification of the peace treaty with Great Britain and negotiations with Spain. France had already been negotiated with at this point, but Spain, and got more money from the Netherlands while he was in that position. He gave George Washington the first oath of office as president. He made the Louisiana Purchase, and he brought steam power to the United States to increase shipping while helping to construct the Erie Canal. Robert R. Livingston is one of the most important American founders. And in fact, every year I do it, if you're new here, every year I've done a Founding Fathers fantasy draft. It's kind of like my top 100 American founders. Believe it or not, it does change every year because I read more, I research more, and my opinion oh, this guy maybe is more important than I thought he was. Robert Livingston's already been pretty high on the list. I have a feeling he's going up this year after re-evaluating him to do this, make this conversation. Actually, with all that on the resume, you'd think people would know more about him. Yeah, it's tough for Livingston's because there's so many of them. Unfortunately, unlike the Schuyler sisters, the Livingston sisters have not been featured in any play anytime recently. But because like his brother is William Livingston, this whole time his brother's governor of New Jersey for the whole revolution. Also voted for independence and left before signing. Two Livingstons voted for independence, left before signing. But his cousin, oh no. He was from the other train of the family. I apologize. William is his cousin, as is William's brother, Philip Livingston, who did sign the Constitution. So there were Declaration of Independence. Let me get my train of thought together. There were 3 Livingstons that voted for independence. Only one of them actually signed the Declaration. His younger brother, Edward, would move to be important to the development of Louisiana after his big brother made the purchase. And then go on to be Secretary of State, I think it was, for Andrew Jackson. His cousin William's daughter, Sarah, married John Jay. Another one of his sisters married that Reverend we talked about recently. So, like, the Livingstons, like, I like to make the joke that, like, in Hamilton, they married a Schuyler sister. Yeah. And it's like, that's because they couldn't marry a Livingston. Which, again, I feel really chauvinistic and kind of disgusting talking about, like, marrying a woman in that nature. I certainly married a woman for reasons that, not financial reasons, but that's how they thought at the time. So sorry, Hamilton. Second best. You just couldn't. I'm trying to make a "you're not as good as John Jay" joke for Hamilton, but like they're about the same. We're being honest. They're both always top 10 in my list. Anyway, let's carry on. Oh, I should note, just last week we spoke about Henry, something Livingston. Henry Bleecker? Henry, he's got a weird middle name. Who was his, Sarah Livingston's brother. So his cousin's son. However that counts out. Let's go though, because we're already 25 minutes in, and we're on founder number 3. We got a lot to talk about. So let's talk about Jonathan Dayton. Jonathan Dayton is from a pretty important New Jersey family. His father, Elias or Elias, I can never figure out which way that goes. His father was an important New Jerseyan. Dayton goes to Princeton. About at the same time as John Adams, James Madison is there. Aaron Burr is there. These are the people he goes to college with. Now, he leaves early in 1775 to join the New Jersey militia. And he does. He joins up his father's unit. His father did really important things, especially in upstate New York. His father defended some important forts. Dayton goes, he's just 15 years old when he joins the militia. And by the time he's 16, he's already an officer. He's serving as a lieutenant. It's a low-level officer, but it's an officer. And he's a child. At the time, they didn't consider him a child. I think 15 is a child. Feel free to disagree with me. A big child, sure. Anyway, he serves under his father. He serves in the New Jersey campaign. He serves at Henry Brockholz. Thank you, Ashley. He serves at the New Jersey campaign. He winters at Valley Forge. He's part of the Forge War. Eventually, he leaves the militia. And yes, that is it, Ashley. Eventually, he leaves the militia and joins the Continental Army, and he joins the Sullivan Expedition, also sometimes called the Sullivan-Clinton Campaign, where they went across upstate New York, routing the Native Americans, the Iroquois Nation, who essentially evacuated as they came, and the Americans burned their crops and villages. There was one battle, but primarily the Native Americans ran away, which was probably best because they were coming a-burning. Unfortunately, they created kind of a humanitarian crisis in Niagara, at Fort Niagara, for the British, who promised to take care of the Native Americans, but just didn't have the food to. So it was, as with most conversation about the Native Americans, it ends kind of sadly for them. Though I did learn last weekend, I went on the trip, I didn't realize I knew that the Native Americans then retaliated. I didn't realize how much retaliation there was. Not to get too off track, but the Native Americans went through completing what the Patriots called massacres, which in many fashions it could be considered that, though massacres, as they were called, did go back and forth quite frequently throughout the years of colonialism. But I forgot to turn off my monitor over there. Whoopsie. You know what? Timeout. I'm sorry to do this. I will be right. Okay, sorry about that. One person bounced in and then left. I forgot to turn off the baby monitor in here, and they're doing bedtime, and I don't know if you can hear it or not, but it distracts me. Anyway, the Native Americans came through, did the Cherry Valley Massacre, Wyoming Massacre. There were a bunch of what the Patriots called massacres, where they would raid villages in the frontier of upstate New York. So, the following year, 1779, the Sullivan Clinton campaign goes through and burns all their villages. And the following year, and this is not often talked about, the Native Americans came back and did some more pretty severe raids, though they were much smaller at that point because there were so many people had evacuated upstate New York. The frontier outside Albany apparently had about 10,000 settlers when the Revolutionary War started and had 3,000 settlers when it ended, which is tough. Anyway, Jonathan Dayton went through and helped go through the Sullivan Clinton campaign, which was the most successful of all of these campaigns. Unfortunately, not long after that, he was captured by loyalists, and he actually spent the winter of 1780 and 81 as a prisoner, though he was released the following spring. And he rejoins the war effort just in time to go and participate in the Battle of Yorktown. Victory at last. After that, Dayton goes back to New Jersey, continues his studies, becomes a lawyer, starts a law firm. Yay! He then goes and is elected to the New Jersey State Assembly. And then he's chosen to go to the Constitutional Convention. And he stays in the Constitutional Convention for the whole summer. He doesn't speak much because he's the youngest person in the room. And in fact, in September of 1787, Jonathan Dayton is the youngest person to sign the United States Constitution at 26 years old. Some of you might not be that age yet, and that doesn't seem that old to you. As someone approaching 40, I assure you, 26 is an extraordinarily young age to be signing the government of the United States. I'll also note Thomas Jefferson was 32 when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, so let that sink in for a minute. Anyhoozle, Dayton is then elected to the United States Congress. He is an inaugural congressman from New Jersey. But he doesn't go for personal reasons. He stays home and just ignores the first United States Congress. And then they elect him again. And then he goes. He's like, all right, if you're going to vote me in twice, I'll go in 2 years late. Granted, by the time he goes for the first time, that's about when Rhode Island's showing up. So there's that. Now, he does a good job there, and he actually ends up becoming Speaker of the House for several years. And Speaker of the House essentially let him lead the debates in the United States Congress. This is in the John Adams administration. By the time he turns 40 years old, he's spent about a decade in the United States House of Representatives, has signed the Constitution, and only then is he chosen to be a senator representing New Jersey. And this is when things start going not super great for Johnny Dayton over here. You see, Dayton has a friend, and he loans his friend money for a new business venture. Unfortunately, this friend is Aaron Burr, and that venture is invading Texas. Now, we've discussed this kind of a lot frequently, so I'm not going to get too deep into it, but Aaron Burr may or may not have been trying to put together a little invasion of what was then Spanish territory, and he may or may not have been trying to start a new country that may or may not have wanted to declare war on the United States. Now, I don't believe most of that. A lot of it comes from James Wilkinson, who is proven to be a very not trustworthy character, as we spoke about last week. That being said, he was being very shady about it. Either way, Jonathan Dayton, who had made a lot of money at this point in his life, loaned a whole bunch to Aaron Burr for this mission. Dayton, along with Burr, is put on trial for treason as a United States Senator. Now, like Burr, he is acquitted. And Dayton even more so. Even if he had an idea what Burr was doing, Burr was telling lies. So if you invest money with someone and they go spend it differently than you were told as an investor, you really not to blame for that. But the court of public opinion did not agree, and his career was over, at least in public. He went back to his private life in New Jersey, where he made lots of money and seems to have lived a pretty happy life. But his political career ended, and he was like 42 years old, which again is not super old for all that he had accomplished. So that's Jonathan Dayton. Who's next? Excuse me. Jeremiah Van Rensselaer. Okay, take a sip of water. Excuse me. Hitting it with my teeth. Ding, ding, ding. We're going to New York again. We're going to talk about it. Someone else with Dutch heritage, just like Robert Livingston. Rensselaers also had a manor. Probably the more wealthy one. Rensselaer was... Jeremiah over here was not one of the members of the family inheriting any cash. But Jerry goes, before the war breaks out, Jeremiah was part of a creator of the Albany Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty were not just in Boston. They're also kind of famous for being in New York. There was one in Charleston. There's a little one in Philly. Albany, New York, as I mentioned before, was a very important town at the time. And it was right in the middle of Rensselaer Manor. Albany, the city, was its own thing, separate from any private ownership. But all the land for miles and miles and miles around were owned by the Rensselaer family. So having a Rensselaer come to this meeting where they created the Sons of Albany is extremely important. Gave it a little bit of weight and makes him kind of a Sam Adams type figure for Albany. 1 foot in with the rabble and 1 foot in with the rich and propertied. So what they do in Albany, they sign what's called the Albany Constitution. Now, don't let that fool you. Constitutions are usually laws of government. These were more like resolutions, which were popular at the time before the American Revolution began. A town would get together, a bunch of people would say, this is what we want, someone would write it down, they'd all sign it as a resolution. For this, they called it a constitution, seemingly because it's when they established the Sons of Liberty. And this is the 1760s. Now, he ends up becoming a member of both the Committee of Safety, and which oversaw the militia, and a member of the Committee of Correspondence, which he eventually became chairman of, which meant he was in charge with communicating with all the other towns and cities and colonies throughout British North America in the build-up to the Revolutionary War. Once the war breaks out, he's actually chosen to serve as paymaster of the Continental Army. A very thankless job, I assure you, because there was no money to pay anyone with. He does this for a few years. After the war, he goes on, he serves in the New York State Assembly. Eventually, the United States Constitution comes around, and Jeremiah Van Rensselaer is voted in as an inaugural member of the United States House of Representatives. While he's in the House, something very interesting happens. He meets this guy, Louis Osmond. So Louis Osmond was a wealthy French guy who saw the French Revolution turning super violent against wealthy French guys. And he wanted to get out. So he leaves, comes over, he purchases land in upstate New York. Unfortunately, Timothy Pickering had just negotiated a treaty with the Native Americans in the area, and that land was not for sale. Secretary of State Jefferson asked Jeremiah Van Rensselaer to come in and be the person, the point man, to remedy this situation. Unfortunately, there is no remedy. The treaty has been signed, and they can't settle that land. So Louis Osmond ends up going to Philadelphia, where he becomes a very, 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 very wealthy merchant. So it works out for him. But it was a really interesting little side story I found when I was researching him, so I wanted to throw that in there. As for Rensselaer, he tries to get elected back to the U.S. House of Representatives and loses. So instead, he runs for lieutenant governor, and he chose to run alongside George Clinton, who had been governor for all of the Revolution. So this is a good time to do it. There was a few years in there where John Jay took over, but then George Clinton came back. And when he comes back, Rensselaer runs with him, becomes lieutenant governor of New York State. He is there for a few years until Governor Clinton decides to run with Jefferson for vice president and replace Aaron Burr. And at that point, Van Rensselaer retires to his countryside estate, lives in vast wealth, and is proud of himself, one would assume. So that is Jeremiah Van Rensselaer. Kind of a role player. Ran through him a little bit quickly because, well, we spent a lot of time on some other people. Take one more quick sip of water. I got a little tickle in my throat today. I apologize for that. So let's talk about James Reed. Oh, man. James Reed. This story is short and it is sad. James Reed was a New Hampshire colonist or colonial who fought in the French and Indian War. He had served in the militia. By the time the American Revolution starts coming around, Reed has already built a town that we now know as Fitzwilliam. He built the first tavern in that town, the first inn in that town. He was a leader in the village, and he was a lieutenant colonel in the colonial militia. And then the revolution starts. And once Lexington and Concord happens, New Hampshire right away is on board to help. And they create 3 regiments, which should be usually 1,000 men each, that are to be sent to help out in Boston. Each regiment has a colonel appointed to it. The 3 men are John Stark, Enoch Poor, and James Reed. And James Reed takes control of the 3rd New Hampshire Division. They go to Boston. He fights in Bunker Hill, and he's there when George Washington shows up. Now, in 1775, Washington reorganizes the entire Continental Army, and when they do that, they absorb a bunch of regiments from militias that were willing to be absorbed. One of this was Reed's unit, which becomes the 2nd New Hampshire Regiment. Reed had proven himself really well during the siege of Boston, and he is eventually elevated to Brigadier General in the Continental Army. Now, before he receives word of this, he's actually sent up to Canada to help with the, invasion of Canada is what they wanted him to help with, but what he helped with was the evacuation of Canada, because by the time he got there, things were not going well. And in fact, most of the army had caught smallpox. And when Reed gets there as John Thomas, Major General John Thomas, same thing, they get smallpox, Thomas dies, Reed goes blind and nearly deaf. And that is how his body is when word arrives that he's been promoted to Brigadier General in the Continental Army. This is in August of 1776. He goes back home to recuperate, but by January 77, he resigns his position. He just can't do it anymore. He just can't. Now, he ends up living another 30 years till 85. It's hard to determine exactly how his health was affected afterwards. It doesn't seem that he went totally deaf, but it does not sound like he got his sight back. So, a very brave participant early in the war, and sadly could have been one of the major leaders of the American Revolution had he not fallen victim to the pox so early on in the hostilities. So, we're going to move on to something not so sad as soon as we can. John Armstrong Sr., who for some reason I put in like hot green, so sorry about that. I know it's hard to look at. Excuse me, that is a little tickle. Anyway, John Armstrong Sr., the hero of Kittanning. Now, spoiler alert, after this guy, we're going to talk about his son, John Armstrong Jr., who had an even bigger role in the American founding. Now, as for Armstrong, as a young man, he was living in England. he studied and received an education in engineering, and he was actually hired by the Penn family, who still owned Pennsylvania up into the Revolution. He was hired by the Penn family to come over and work as an engineer for the colony of Pennsylvania. He surveyed huge portions of the state, and he even laid out the town of Carlisle, which he eventually made his home. He ends up serving in the French and Indian War. Now, during the French and Indian War, he is involved with what's called the Kittening Expedition, or sometimes called the Armstrong Expedition or the Battle of Kittening. Now, as I mentioned before, oftentimes the colonists would do something that the Native Americans considered massacres. Native Americans would do something the colonists considered massacres. The Kittening Expedition, the Native Americans do consider a massacre. From my perspective, while I'm certainly not an expert on the particulars of the battle, from what I read, it seems to be kind of a normal little attack there, where Armstrong led a unit of men towards the Native American village of Kittening. On the way, he sends a detachment of his men to go scout out the area. He doesn't hear back from them. Eventually, he gets to the village, which is mostly deserted, although one of the leaders, who the name escapes me right now, was hiding in a house with his family. They try and get him out. They light the house on fire. That guy jumps out and they kill him. Now, it seems that I believe it was 10 to 20 people that they had scalped, and they took a bunch of prisoners. But it seemed to have been a fairly small engagement. Sounds like most of the villagers had already left. And it doesn't sound like they harmed or intentionally harmed any women and children, though they did light that house on fire with kids in it. So I don't know how that turned out, to be honest. They never really clarified in the few things I read what happened to the women and children in that house. But that being said, it's not really out of the ordinary and not nearly as severe as many of the atrocities committed on both sides for hundreds of years. But as for Armstrong, he became known for this battle. Oh, I should mention, on the way back, the guy he sent as a detachment, when they got to the village to seize it, they found out that most of the soldiers had left. So that's why it was so easy for them to take the town. On the way back, he found the leader of the detachment he sent out showed up mortally wounded and was like, "They found us." I'm like, God. So then Armstrong returns, and because of this event, he becomes known as the hero of Kittering. And that's what I claimed him as over here, because he was famous in his own time for it. Kind of a small battle to be famous for, but nonetheless, that is what happened. Now, later on in the French and Indian War, John Armstrong leads a battalion of Pennsylvania militia in the Forbes expedition. Now, the Forbes expedition was, again, against Native Americans out west, and it was mostly British officers, but Armstrong was leading the Pennsylvania militia, and the Virginia militia was there, being led by George Washington. And Armstrong and George Washington become fast friends, and would remain friends for the rest of their lives. Well, that was good, because once the American Revolution breaks out, well, John Armstrong's on Washington's team now, isn't he? He's on Pennsylvania's team at large. Pennsylvania kind of had difficulty raising troops. There were a lot of conscientious objectors in that state. A lot of Quakers, a lot of Mennonites, people who would not take arms because it was against their religious beliefs. Armstrong was not one of these people. He had already been serving the militia, and when the war breaks out, he's appointed very quickly as a brigadier general in the Pennsylvania militia. After this, he's recruited by the Continental Army, and they give him a command as brigadier general because they want him to go south to Charleston, use his engineering smarts to set up a fortifications in Charleston. And he does this, and largely the victory at the Battle of Sullivan Island, which is very important early in the war, an embarrassment to I believe it was Henry Clinton was the one who led that. He comes back for it later, though. But it's Armstrong's defenses that really help win the Battle of Sullivan Island. Then, when Charles Lee shows up, takes over, Armstrong leaves. He goes back to Pennsylvania. He actually resigns his commission in the Continental Army because he's appointed a major general in the state militia. And as we've seen many times, people would prefer to have a higher rank in their own militia because after the war is over, there's not going to be a Continental Army, but there'll be state militias. He ends up, that doesn't mean he doesn't help the army. In fact, he ends up fighting with the Continental Army at the Battle of Brandywine, and he's where he actually by night helps to retrieve some of Washington's supplies after that battle, and then he participates in the Battle of Germantown, which doesn't work out because there's fog and alleged drunkenness and friendly fire. But Armstrong does what he was asked to do by General Washington very, very well. Almost gets captured for it because, well, everyone else was screwing up. Now, he then, at this point, is 60 years old, and he suffers ill health. He was wounded at one point during the French and Indian War, and that's still lingering. So he actually resigns his position, still in the 1770s. But then he's almost immediately sent to the Continental Congress. He's there for 2 years during the war, goes back home, and then in 1787, he is sent back for 2 more years to the Continental Congress for his final 2 years, where he helps oversee the transition from Articles of Confederation, found it, to the United States Constitution. And what's really interesting, and then he retires for a few years before passing away. What's really interesting about those last 2 years that John Armstrong Sr. was in the Continental Congress, well, John Armstrong Jr. was also in the Continental Congress. Yeah, a father-son team. Now, sometimes we often call the Continental Congress after the Articles of Confederation the Confederation Congress. That's fine. They at the time generally called it the Continental Congress. So, why was Johnny Jr. serving with his dad? Well, let's talk about it. We are going to have to brief back real quick because we got to talk about him at war. We've already missed a lot at this point for John Armstrong Jr., so we'll go back. He was the son of John Armstrong Jr. grew up as the son of the hero of Kittening. Like it or not. He went to Princeton. Actually, now that I'm saying it out loud, he was at Princeton with Jonathan Dayton that we were speaking about earlier. And like Jonathan Dayton, also left college at the same time to go join the Continental Army. His father was in the militia. Junior joined the Continental Army. He ends up going up and helping out with the Quebec campaign. That doesn't work. Eventually, he is appointed as an aide-de-camp to General Hugh Mercer. Hugh Mercer, we talked about, I think last week actually. He was killed in the Battle of Princeton. He was propped up on a tree by his aide-de-camp, John Armstrong. And then after the battle was over, he was carried to a house where he would linger for 9 days in excruciating pain until he passed away. And he was carried from the field by John Armstrong Jr. Still a very young man. Now, Armstrong was still alive. He needed a new job. He is then brought in as an aide-de-camp to Horatio Gates. And I know what you're thinking. Horatio Gates, his aide-de-camps are usually not great, like James Wilkinson. Yeah, well, we'll get there. Now, it should be noted, Armstrong helped fight in the Battle of Saratoga. And then he leaves the army for a few years to continue his studies. Eventually, he is persuaded in 1782, so after Yorktown, he's persuaded by Horatio Gates to come back and sit on his as one of his aides again, even though at this point, Horatio Gates has horribly embarrassed himself at Camden, and he's basically not doing much. But Yorktown happened, so the army went back north to New York, and they're in Newburgh, New York, waiting for the British to leave so they could walk into that city and finally declare themselves the winner. Now, Newburgh is famous at this point for its conspiracy, as it's called, although I was scolded for calling it that today, and I was told I should call it the Newburgh Address, which is also right. But in a very brief summary of something that's kind of famous, and if you don't know, either ask now or look into it. I've made several videos about it. I have a t-shirt for sale on my website with Washington's quote from it. You will permit me to put on my spectacles. George Washington. I think it's really funny and one of the most important quotes in history, because the war was over, and all these soldiers, these officers who had spent their fortunes trying to fight in the war, had not been paid. And the doctors and lawyers and merchants in Continental Congress certainly didn't seem like they had any money, certainly didn't seem like they knew what was going on or if they would be able to pay anyone. So a letter was passed around calling for a meeting. And George Washington found out about the letter. He ended up calling the meeting and said, I won't be there. And then he shows up and everyone's like, what is George doing here? He said he wasn't going to come. And Washington reads this address that he had written, or he had some help from some friends, but he had his famous Newburgh Address. And what's really important is he couldn't read what he wrote down. So he said, You'll permit me to put on my spectacles, for I've grown not only gray, but nearly blind in service of my country. And then he put on his glasses, which no one had ever seen George Washington wear his glasses. And that was one of the most important speeches in American history, because all these grown men, these hardened generals and soldiers, all started weeping because they had forsaken their ideals, except Timothy Pickering, who's not my favorite character. He's kind of a shady guy, but at least he stood by his laurels, and he said, that's all it takes. He's just got to put on his glasses. We're just going to give up. I tell this story because the meeting was called in the first place because a letter circulated camp. It was called An Address to the Officers, and it was written by John Armstrong Jr., allegedly. So we don't know who actually wrote the letter. It's been questioned, but Armstrong actually refers to it in correspondence later in his life. So the overall assumption is that John Armstrong Jr. more than a little bit likely to have been the author of this letter that brought it. And then actually he wrote another one that he circulated after Washington said, okay, you guys can have a meeting, but let's not be so secretive about it. He wrote another letter to the officers saying, hey, look, Washington's on our side, which was not true, as the Newburgh Address confirmed. I have another story about the Newburgh Address, but I'll tell it at the end if we can, because Armstrong then goes to the Continental Congress. As I said, he ends up representing Pennsylvania alongside his father at the Continental Congress. And this is in 1787, 88. So he's actually there when they ratify the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is extremely important. It helped write the rules for how they settle all the territories that's now Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, parts of Mississippi, maybe Mississippi, but Minnesota, where the Mighty Ducks played. So he writes all that, and John Armstrong is there, and he is actually asked to become Chief Justice of the Northwest Territory. Now, he turns this down. He doesn't seem interested in it. He goes back to private life. He moves to New York, lives in New York for a while, and then eventually, after about a decade living private life, he is chosen as a member of the United States Senate, serving alongside his old friend Jonathan Dayton. He goes to the United States Senate, and then Thomas Jefferson asks him to replace who else but Robert Livingston, who we were just talking about, as representative minister to France. And he goes to France, and he hangs out with the Napoleonic government for about 6 years, until coming back. He doesn't do a whole lot while he's over there, but he comes back, and he is asked in 1913 to become Secretary of War. At this point, James Madison is now president, and he has Armstrong to become Secretary of War. Now, this is a little bit controversial, because as I said, with most of Horatio Gates' aides de camp, Horatio Gates seems a little shady. James Wilkinson was most certainly shady. People thought he was shady. His approval to get voted in as Secretary of War was 18 to 15. And at this point, the Federalist Party is already on its way out. It's mostly Democratic Republicans there. So it should have been pretty easy to pick someone who could have come in and taken over. Because again, this is in 1813 to take control of the War of 1812, which had already been ongoing. He does this. Now, he wins just over his longtime rival, James Monroe. Now, granted, James Monroe was Secretary of State and would take over Secretary of War after Armstrong, and I'm going to explain why in a second, and then Monroe would go on to be the next president. So we know who wins that battle. Now, I want to give Armstrong credit. He spends 2 of the basically 3.5 years of the War of 1812 in charge of the war. I mean, the president's in charge, but he is Secretary of War, so he's extraordinarily important. He plays a large role in getting troops to New York. A lot of the battles were in upstate New York, on the St. Lawrence River, on the Hudson River, in the Great Lakes. So I don't want to minimize his role, but he just didn't think they'd go for Washington, D.C. At the time, Washington, D.C. was still a young city. They'd been building it for about 20 years, but it was in the swamp, and it was not a fabulous place to be. It wouldn't be for a very long time a nice city at all. Personally, I don't love big cities, so I don't know what your current opinion of Washington, D.C. is, but if you like Washington, D.C. as a city, not as, the people there, obviously. Wait, I'm sorry. Regular people there are fine. The people sent there from around the country, yeah. But no politics on this channel. Anyway, um, uh, Armstrong just didn't think they'd come. And in fact, at a certain point, they did come. And even when they were like coming up the bay, he still didn't think they were coming for Washington, D.C. Until they came and famously burned it. All of it, including the White House. Because Armstrong put up zero defense at all. This quickly had him removed. Unfortunately, like I said, the war ends just 4 months later. So it's hard to blame him too much because it was a lot of his efforts keeping it as a draw. Because essentially the War of 1812 does end as a draw. I know Andrew Jackson famously wins the Battle of New Orleans, but that is about 2 months after the war had actually ended with the Treaty of Ghent. So, which Armstrong missed because he came home. His replacement, whose name was Jonathan Russell, signed the Treaty of Ghent alongside John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, actually. And I think there were 2 other people, but their names escape me. They're not important. I shouldn't say that. They probably were important, but that's not the point. Now, the most fascinating thing about John Armstrong Jr., a man who signed up in the Continental Army in 1775. A man who, yada, 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 part of the Madison, blah, 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 blah. He was a Continental congressman who lived long enough to have his photograph taken. That is Continental Congressman John Armstrong Jr. And I guess his dog and his gun. I'm not sure. But he was the longest living and last surviving delegate to the Continental Congress. This picture, or daguerreotype, as it was known at the time, was taken in 1840, and he passed away in 1843. So this is the only Continental Congressman who you can actually see. Now, you used to have to sit really still for a while to take pictures like this. I'm really impressed by the dog, who must have had to sit still for like 30 seconds. Some weird flashing light. I don't know why that impresses me. I also know that he's kind of just like a down-home farmer, which I think is fascinating. The Wild West hasn't really taken it. How old was he then? He was like 16 or 17 in 75. And then 40, 65 years. So 65, 75, probably like 83. He lived a while. He did good. There are some other founders, like John Quincy Adams. Actually, he has a photograph too that's kind of famous. Which maybe I'll talk about John Quincy next week, because he's a really fascinating character, because he grew up with the Revolution. He was a little bit younger, but he went to Europe with his dad, and he was educated in Europe, which a boy of his stature should not have had that opportunity. And then he ends up being like George Washington's minister to the Netherlands, and his dad's minister to Great Britain. And then he's like John Quincy Adams in Europe for a very long time, till the Treaty of Ghent. He comes home real quick to serve in the U.S. Senate, but he is like the guy when it comes to international diplomacy. That's why he becomes Monroe's Secretary of State, and then he becomes President of the United States. And then after he loses president after one term, he's the only former president to run for the House of Representatives, and he spends almost 20 years after he was president in the House of Representatives. John Quincy Adams is one of the most fascinating Americans. I have no more words for him. Which is perfect, because I'm going to take this down, because it's cutting off half my screen, because we just hit 1 hour and 1 minute. Whammy, I nailed it. Well, what do you know? Some of these stories were long and some were really short, but I guess that works out. Anyway, guys, it's starting to get hot in here. I did just shower before I did this. Turn off my AC, and the room does not hold it in. So I am going to get going. Thank you so much for watching this whole time. Really appreciate it. As always, a like is the fanciest pansiest thing we can do. I should also note on the Discord channel, I put up some questions over there. I'm thinking about, I know you guys said I'm thinking about doing a little bit more live videos. I'm going to do them kind of randomly, I think. I know you guys want me to watch some videos and talk about them. I'm deciding how to do that. It's hard to fit in my schedule. Once fall comes, like summertime is tough. Once the autumn shows up, we would do that a little bit better. And I was also thinking about playing some games. A while back, I played a game once or twice on here. There are a bunch of revolutionary games out there. If you guys are interested in maybe playing against me, let me know what game. It has to be a PC game or I can't play it. But if that's something you're interested in, I played like Revolution 1775. They're really tabletop games, but we can play against each other on here. I could broadcast it and talk about the history behind the battles we're actually doing. If that's some cool. Deborah, hi, thank you. Yeah, it is fun. You know what? If you're not in tab, if I can, what's going on here? There is a link. Okay, enable through. Oh man, it's asking me to like do things. Stop it. Stop it. Just give me the link. There is a link here. I am going to put it in the description if I can get my hands on it. They changed it around. They made it nicer. And now I'm having trouble finding the link to our thing. Where's the server link? Oh, Deborah, I'm so sorry. I'm trying to find it. And now I'm invite people. Oh, derp. Let's copy that link. I will throw it over here. Anyone just popping in? We are just wrapping up. I am putting a link in the description to our Discord channel. The link only runs for a little bit, and now I'm not maintaining smooth video because I brought up Discord, and Discord has video of its own, and it doesn't like that I've brought up two videos simultaneously. But if you are interested in joining us, that would be the way to do it. Thank you guys for watching. And everyone left because it's... Nope, two people are here. Okay. I am going to go anyway. We made it to the end. Next time I won't click any other buttons. Thank you for watching, and I will see you for trivia tomorrow and bid you adieu with